They fire, and nothing happens the way it should. The silence after impact is wrong, heavy, accusing, and deadly. This was supposed to be certainty, a moment where faith becomes survival, but the weapon slips away and leaves them exposed. What was promised as control turns into betrayal in the dark, with no second chance and no room to ask why. Somewhere far from this steel hull, someone already feared this moment was coming. Not enough to stop it, not enough to warn the men waiting for results that never arrive. When a system fails this completely, in a moment this final, who decides that the people depending on it are acceptable losses? The submarine holds its breath as the target slides into the killing lane, steel shadow against darker water, close enough to feel inevitable, close enough that failure is no longer an option, and the order is given without ceremony because this is what they trained for, and this is what they trust. The weapon leaves the tube clean and confident, a straight promise cutting forward, and for a few seconds every man aboard believes the night is about to end in their favor. Then the second stretch. The expected violence never arrives. No shock, no rupture. Only movement, wrong movement, as the target keeps going, untouched, unaware, still alive. Another weapon follows, then another, each one a wager placed with shrinking faith, each one vanishing into the same silence. And now the air inside the boat changes because disbelief has teeth. The commander recalculates without numbers, watching angles close, knowing the enemy's escorts are out there somewhere, knowing that every failed strike is time stolen from survival. The crew listens for something that never comes, a confirmation that would mean the weapon did what it was meant to do, but the water stays calm and the target refuses to die. They fire again, closer this time, closer than comfort allows, and the result is the same empty nothing. The same sinking realization that the problem is not chance and not bad luck, but something deeper and more dangerous. Above them, the enemy continues on its course, cargo intact, mission unbroken, while below, the submarine is now the hunted thing, forced to linger in the open because retreat would admit a truth no one is ready to say out loud. The commander feels it first, the shift from aggression to exposure, the understanding that their greatest threat is no longer the enemy's guns but their own unanswered shots. When the escorts finally begin to circle, when distant sounds harden into intent, the crew understands that the failure has already decided the night's outcome. This was the moment everything broke, not with an explosion, but with absence, with promises dissolving in the dark while the enemy sails on untouched, and the men who trusted the system are left counting the cost of a weapon that refused to be lethal when it mattered most. Before that night, before the silence and the unanswered shots, there was belief, strong and unshaken, built carefully and repeated often until it felt like truth rather than hope. This weapon was not spoken of as experimental or uncertain, but as reliable, as something already proven, already tested enough to be trusted with lives and missions that cannot afford doubt. Crews were taught to see it as an extension of their own intent, a straight line between decision and result, a tool that removed hesitation from the act of attack and replaced it with confidence. When the order came to fire, it was supposed to end the question immediately, to turn risk into resolution and danger into distance. The expectation was simple and powerful. Aim correctly, fire cleanly, and the outcome would take care of itself. There was no room in that belief for hesitation, no space for imagining that the weapon might choose its own path or betray the moment it was needed most. It was treated as a constant in a world full of variables, the one element that would not change when pressure closed in and choices narrowed. That confidence shaped everything, from how close commanders were willing to approach to how long they stayed exposed, because they believed the first strike would end the encounter before it could turn against them. The system was not framed as a gamble, but as a guarantee, something that allowed boldness to feel justified and aggression to feel safe. Men went into combat believing they carried certainty with them, believing that when the moment came, they would not be arguing with their own equipment while the enemy moved freely above. What failed that night was not just a weapon, but an entire expectation carefully built around it, an expectation that said preparation had already answered every important question. The contrast was brutal and immediate, because the moment demanded proof and received none, demanded finality and received delay, demanded impact and received silence. Everything the system promised to be in theory vanished in practice, replaced by confusion and exposure that no briefing had prepared them for. The weapon that was meant to simplify the fight instead complicated it, forcing commanders to hesitate in seconds that could not be spared, forcing crews to watch opportunities pass while they waited for a result that never came. This was not a subtle mismatch or a small deviation from expectation, but a complete inversion, where the thing meant to remove danger became the reason danger multiplied. The belief that had allowed them to close distance now trapped them there, because they had shaped their tactics around a certainty that no longer existed. When the weapon failed to deliver, it didn't just miss a target. It collapsed the logic of the entire engagement, leaving men to improvise in an environment that punished improvisation without mercy. The contrast was impossible to ignore because it unfolded in real time, not in reports or discussions, but in the dark with hostile forces drawing closer and no margin for correction. What had been sold as dependable became unpredictable, and what had been trusted as decisive became something crews had to second-guess in the very moment they needed it most. This gap between promise and reality did not feel like a flaw to be studied later. It felt like a betrayal happening now, one that rewrote the rules of engagement without warning. The expectation had been that failure was an exception, something rare enough to be dismissed, but the reality suggested something far more unsettling, that the certainty itself had been an illusion. In that realization, confidence turned into caution, and caution turned into fear, because once the idea of reliability collapsed, nothing else felt stable. The night did not just expose a malfunction. It exposed how deeply belief had shaped behavior, and how dangerous it was to discover the truth only after the first shot had already been fired and the second chance was gone. After that night, the silence stops feeling unique, and that is when it becomes terrifying, because it begins to echo across other patrols, other commanders, other moments that should have ended cleanly but instead dissolve into the same empty pause. Different waters, different targets, different crews, yet the same unsettling absence where an ending should have been. Weapons are fired with the same confidence, at the same kinds of ranges, under the same conditions that doctrine says should guarantee success, and again the results refuse to arrive. Targets continue on their paths, undamaged and unaware, while the submarines that attack them linger too long, trapped by their own expectations. Commanders start to recognize the feeling before it fully forms, that tightening in the chest when seconds pass without confirmation, when the quiet stretches past what instinct says is normal. Some try again immediately, convinced the first failure was chance, that the second will restore faith, but the pattern repeats, and now repetition replaces disbelief. In one encounter, the enemy escapes entirely, the opportunity gone not because of enemy skill, but because the weapon never delivers the outcome it promises. In another, escorts are alerted by the very act of repeated firing, turning a clean ambush into a desperate evasion where survival becomes the only remaining objective. Crews begin to whisper about it in the narrow spaces between stations, not loudly, not officially, but enough that the idea spreads that something is wrong in a way that cannot be ignored. These are not edge cases or extreme conditions, but ordinary moments where the system should function without question, yet it refuses to do so again and again. The sameness is what makes it impossible to dismiss, because coincidence relies on variation, and here there is none. The same setup leads to the same failure, and the outcome always tilts in the enemy's favor. Each incident chips away at confidence, not in dramatic collapse but in slow erosion, where every success feels suspicious and every failure feels expected. Commanders start adjusting behavior without admitting why, closing distance less aggressively, firing more weapons than planned, staying exposed longer than doctrine ever intended, all in an attempt to force a result that should have come naturally. These adjustments do not fix the problem. They magnify its cost, because every extra moment spent waiting is a moment the enemy can react. The pattern becomes clear in hindsight but cruelly obvious in real time, because it unfolds under pressure where denial feels safer than acceptance. To accept the pattern is to accept that the system itself cannot be trusted, and that is a thought few are willing to voice while still in the fight. Yet the incidents keep accumulating, each one reinforcing the last, each one stripping away another layer of certainty. Reports begin to sound eerily similar, even when written by different hands, describing the same hollow outcome in different words, as if the story is being retold by men who have never met but share the same shock. The failures are not dramatic explosions or visible malfunctions that can be pointed to and explained away. They are defined by absence, by what does not happen when everything says it should. That absence becomes the connecting thread, tying separate missions into a single narrative of disappointment and danger. The realization creeps in that this is not a matter of bad nights or unlucky shots, but a behavior baked into the system itself, something consistent enough to reproduce across encounters. The enemy does not change. The environment does not suddenly conspire, but the outcome remains stubbornly the same. With every repeated failure, the cost grows, not only in missed opportunities, but in the psychological weight carried by crews who now approach each attack with doubt layered over training. The pattern forces an unspoken calculation, whether to trust the weapon and risk exposure or hesitate and risk letting the enemy go, and neither choice feels acceptable. This is how a systemic problem announces itself, not with a single catastrophic moment but with a series of smaller ones that refuse to be isolated. By the time the repetition is undeniable, damage has already been done, because systems like this are not tested in isolation but in the lives and decisions of people who have no choice but to use them. The pattern does not ask permission to exist. It asserts itself through consistency, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. What began as an unsettling anomaly now stands revealed as something far more dangerous, a flaw that follows crews into every engagement, quietly shaping outcomes while pretending to be reliable. The question is no longer whether the failure will happen again, but how many more times it will be allowed to repeat before someone admits that this is not misfortune, but design behaving exactly as it always has. Long before the pattern became impossible to deny in combat, before crews whispered about silence and commanders learned to dread empty seconds, the unease had already surfaced in quieter places where pressure felt distant and consequences seemed abstract. Questions had been raised that did not sound dramatic at the time, phrased carefully, framed as concerns rather than accusations, and passed along in the belief that someone higher up would notice and respond. Tests had produced results that did not quite match expectation, moments where outcomes fell off just enough to invite doubt, but not enough to halt momentum. Reports hinted at inconsistencies, at behavior that did not align with what was promised. Yet each warning arrived wrapped in uncertainty, easy to soften, easier to postpone. There is always another explanation available, another assumption that could be made to preserve confidence and avoid disruption. The system had already been embraced, already distributed, already woven into plans and doctrine, and to stop and question, it would have meant admitting that something fundamental might be wrong. Those early signals were not shouted from rooftops. They were buried in cautious language, in recommendations to observe further, to gather more information, to revisit the issue later when time allowed. Later never seemed urgent, because no single warning carried the weight of catastrophe on its own. Instead, doubt accumulated slowly, spread thin across documents and discussions that never quite converged into action. The structure rewarded continuity, not interruption, and the path of least resistance was to move forward and trust that any minor issues would resolve themselves or prove insignificant in real conditions. Concerns were passed along, then passed over, their edges dulled by layers of review that favored reassurance over alarm. No one needed to lie outright. Silence and delay were enough to keep the machine moving. By the time combat reports began echoing those early doubts, the gap between knowledge and action had already widened. Acknowledging the warnings now would mean accepting that lives had been placed at risk by choice, that confidence had been maintained not because it was earned but because it was convenient. So the response remained cautious, measured, and slow, as if the problem might fade if handled gently. Each ignored signal made the next easier to dismiss, until the accumulation of warnings formed a shadow, no longer tied to any single source but impossible to trace back cleanly. What emerges is not the image of sudden realization but of prolonged hesitation, a steady decision to wait rather than act. The knowledge existed in fragments, scattered and deniable, but together they told a story that was never fully confronted. This was not a failure of awareness but of willingness, a series of moments where stopping felt more dangerous to careers and plans than continuing felt to lives at sea. The warnings did not disappear. They were simply absorbed into a system that had already decided what it wanted to believe. And when the consequences finally arrived in the dark, they did not come as a surprise to everyone, only to those who had been shielded from the doubts that never made it past quiet rooms and careful words. The cost of the failure is not measured in diagrams or memos, but in the faces of men who went into the dark believing their tools would answer when called. Inside the submarines, trust was not abstract. It was personal, built into every decision a commander made when he chose how close to approach, how long to remain exposed, and when to risk everything on a single strike. When the weapon failed, that trust collapsed in the most intimate way possible, forcing crews to confront danger without the shield they had been promised. The moments after a silent hit were filled with a kind of fear that training could not erase, the fear of waiting too long, of knowing the enemy might already be reacting while you are still hoping for a result that will not come. Men stood at their stations listening to the hull, reading each vibration as a possible response, knowing that the failure had shifted the balance against them. Some crews escaped by luck and caution, carrying the memory of close calls that should never have happened. Others were pushed into desperate maneuvers, staying submerged beyond comfort, rationing air and patience while hostile forces searched above. The psychological toll lingered even when the immediate danger passed, because every subsequent attack carried the weight of uncertainty, the knowledge that courage and skill might again be undercut by a system that refused to cooperate. Commanders bore a particular burden, forced to decide whether to trust doctrine or instinct, whether to fire again or withdraw and accept the enemy's escape. Those decisions followed them long after the patrol ended, replayed in quiet moments where outcomes could not be changed. Crews talked less about the enemy and more about themselves, about what they could have done differently, even when the truth was that the failure lay beyond their control. Loss, when it came, felt especially cruel, because it was not tied to being outmatched or outmaneuvered but to being let down. The absence of visible cause made grief harder to process, turning it inward rather than outward. Men who survived carried a fractured confidence, returning to sea knowing that the same conditions might produce the same betrayal again. The system had not only endangered missions, it had altered the emotional landscape of combat, replacing certainty with suspicion and turning every success into a question mark. In this way, the human cost extended beyond individual encounters, shaping how crews fought, how they trusted, and how they understood their own vulnerability. Real people paid for decisions made far from the water, not in theory, but in fear, exhaustion, and the quiet knowledge that survival sometimes depended on nothing more than luck compensating for a failure that should never have reached them. What lingers after the patrol's end is not closure, but an unease that refuses to settle, because nothing about this story resolves cleanly. The failures do not end with a single correction or a clear admission. They fade into procedure, into quiet adjustments that never fully acknowledge what came before. The system continues, altered but never openly confronted, carrying with it the weight of decisions that were made when delay felt safer than truth. For those who live through the silence, the memory does not recede into history, but stays present, a reminder that trust can be manufactured faster than it can be earned. The most unsettling part is not that a weapon failed, but that the failure was allowed to persist long enough to shape behavior, outcomes, and lives. Somewhere between the first unanswered shot and the last quiet report, accountability blurred, dissolved into layers where responsibility became difficult to pin down and easy to avoid. The institution moved forward, as institutions do, leaving individuals to reconcile their experiences without a clear acknowledgement of what had gone wrong. This leaves a question hanging in the dark, unanswered and uncomfortable, about how many other moments were smoothed over, how many other warnings were softened, how many other crews were sent out with confidence built on assumption rather than proof. If this failure could exist quietly, repeated, and tolerated, what else passed through the system unseen until it surfaced at the worst possible moment? The story does not end with correction or justice, but with a lingering doubt about what it takes for truth to break through momentum. The silence that followed those failed shots echoes beyond a single weapon or war, asking whether lessons are learned only when the cost becomes impossible to ignore, and whether even then, some failures are simply absorbed and carried forward. If this happened once, hidden in plain sight, the more disturbing question is not how it was fixed, but how many times the same pattern was allowed to repeat before anyone was forced to listen.